They watched the fire spread before they watched the boy scream. The flames rolled through the livery barn at the edge of Dry Creek like a living thing, swallowing old pine boards and rattling the windows of the saloon across the street. Horses kicked against their stalls inside while sparks climbed into the black Wyoming sky. Men stood under the yellow glow of lanterns with whiskey glasses in their hands, silent as fence posts. Nobody moved. Not after somebody shouted that the child trapped inside was Apache. Elias Boone heard it from halfway down the street while carrying a sack of feed over his shoulder. "Leave him," one rancher muttered near the water trough. "Ain't our blood." Another man spat tobacco into the dirt and looked away from the burning barn like he was tired of the whole world. The fire cracked louder. Then came the sound again. Not a scream this time. Coughing. Small. Choking. Elias stopped walking. Dust rolled across his boots in the hot night wind. For a second, all he could hear was the creak of the wooden sign above the saloon and the distant thunder somewhere out past the mesas. Nobody touched him when he dropped the feed sack into the dirt. Nobody tried stopping him either. They just watched the old cowboy walk toward the fire alone. Elias pulled his hat low against the heat and wrapped his coat around one arm before stepping through the smoke. The air inside the barn felt thick enough to chew. Burning hay drifted through the darkness like glowing snow. A horse burst loose from a stall and disappeared past him into the night. Somewhere deeper inside, the child coughed again. Elias followed the sound through falling ash and beams popping overhead. Then he saw him, a little Apache boy curled beside a water barrel, maybe 8 years old, his small hands wrapped around something hanging from his neck. Eyes wide, frozen. Smoke covered his face in black streaks. "Come on," Elias said, voice rough as gravel. The boy didn't move. Another crack echoed above them. Elias crossed the distance in 2 strides, grabbed the child against his chest, and turned just as part of the roof collapsed behind them in a burst of sparks. Outside, men stumbled backward when Elias emerged from the smoke carrying the boy under one arm. The crowd fell quiet, real quiet. You could hear the horses breathing. Elias lowered the child beside the trough while embers floated around them like fireflies. The boy clutched Elias's sleeve with trembling fingers, but still refused to let go of the leather cord around his neck. Sheriff Doyle Mercer stepped forward slowly, jaw tight beneath his gray mustache. He looked at the child first, then at Elias. "You should have left him," he said flatly. Elias wiped soot from his eyes and stared back at the sheriff without blinking. Fire doesn't ask what color a child is. Nobody answered that. The wind shifted through town, carrying the smell of burned wood and rain somewhere far away. Then the little Apache boy finally opened his hand. Hanging from the cord around his neck was an old brass army button, blackened by smoke, stamped with a faded eagle no one in Dry Creek had seen in over 20 years. By morning, the smell of smoke still clung to Dry Creek like a bad memory that refused to leave town. Thin trails of gray drifted from the ruins of the livery barn, while men rebuilt fence posts in silence and pretended not to look toward Elias Boone's cabin at the north edge of town. But they all looked eventually. They always did. Elias sat on the porch with a tin cup of black coffee cooling between his hands while the Apache boy slept beneath an old wool blanket inside. Dawn light spread slowly across the plains, pale and cold, touching the hills in long strips of gold. Somewhere far off, a coyote cried once before disappearing into the wind. The boy had not said more than 3 words since the fire. He had eaten quietly the night before, sitting at Elias's kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a bowl of stew like somebody afraid it might vanish if he blinked. Every few minutes, his fingers drifted back to the leather cord around his neck. That old brass button never left his hand. Elias heard boots crunching gravel before he saw who it was. Sheriff Doyle Mercer stepped through the gate carrying the weight of the whole town on his shoulders. Dust covered the hem of his coat. He looked tired already, and the day had barely started. "Folks are talking," the sheriff said. Elias took another sip of coffee. "Folks always do." Doyle glanced toward the cabin window. Apache scouts were seen near Miller's Ridge before sunrise. Maybe 20 riders. Elias said nothing. The sheriff lowered his voice. "You know what people are saying? They think that boy is the reason they are here. A long silence settled between them. Wind pushed through the dry grass around the porch. Somewhere nearby, a loose shutter knocked softly against wood. Maybe they are just looking for their child, Elias finally answered. Doyle looked away toward the burned remains of town. That is not how people here see it. Inside the cabin, floorboards creaked. The boy appeared silently in the doorway wrapped in the blanket, dark eyes watching both men carefully. Morning light revealed soot still caught in his hair and a small burn mark across one sleeve. He looked too young to carry the kind of fear sitting behind his eyes. Doyle stared at the brass button hanging from the cord around the boy's neck. His face changed. Not much, just enough. Where did he get that? He asked quietly. Elias turned toward him. You recognize it? The sheriff stepped closer, but the boy instantly tightened his grip on the button and backed into the shadows of the doorway. Doyle stopped walking. That mark belongs to the 7th Cavalry, he said. But they stopped using those buttons over 20 years ago. Elias looked again at the faded eagle pressed into the brass. Smoke had blackened the edges, but the symbol was still there beneath the ash. Old, forgotten, dangerous. The sheriff removed his hat slowly. Last time I saw one of those, he murmured. I was standing beside my father at Fort Bridger. The wind picked up harder across the plains then, carrying dust through town streets and rattling signs above empty storefronts. The boy stared toward the distant red hills beyond Dry Creek, as if listening for something nobody else could hear. Then, faintly, from somewhere miles away across the open land, came the sound of horse bells moving through the morning wind. By noon, Dry Creek had turned quieter than a churchyard after rain. Folks still moved through town, but slower now, speaking low beneath awnings and beside hitching posts whenever Elias Boone's name came up. Rumors traveled fast across western towns, faster than trains sometimes. By lunchtime, half the county had already heard that a white rancher was hiding an Apache child, carrying an old cavalry relic around his neck. Men leaned over poker tables whispering about buried army gold. Women standing outside the general store crossed themselves whenever riders appeared near the hills. Even the wind felt uneasy moving through town that day. Elias spent the afternoon repairing the fence beside his cabin, while the boy sat nearby beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree, quietly carving shapes into the dirt with a stick. He still had not shared his name. Every now and then he lifted his head toward the distant ridges west of Dry Creek. Listening. Always listening. Elias noticed it each time. Like the boy expected somebody to come riding out of those red hills at any moment. The old cowboy hammered another nail into the fence post while sweat rolled down the back of his neck beneath the heat. You got family out there? He asked without turning around. The boy remained silent. A dry gust swept across the prairie, carrying dust through the grass and rattling the loose bucket hanging near the well. Then finally, after a long while, the child spoke softly enough Elias almost missed it. My grandfather. Elias paused. The boy traced circles in the dirt with the stick. He says white men forget promises. The words settled heavy between them. Somewhere behind town, a church bell rang twice before fading into the heat. Elias drove another nail into the fence slower this time. Sometimes they do, he admitted. The boy looked toward him carefully now, dark eyes steady beneath soot-stained hair. But he said one man did not. Elias frowned slightly. Before he could answer, hoofbeats echoed from the road leading into town. 3 riders approached fast through clouds of dust, their horses slick with sweat. Ranchers. Elias recognized all of them. Ben Hollister rode in front with his rifle resting across the saddle. Men like Ben always smelled trouble before anyone else did, and they usually followed it willingly. The riders stopped outside the fence. Ben looked down at the Apache child beneath the tree and his jaw tightened. Town is nervous, he said plainly. Elias rested both hands on the hammer handle. Town gets nervous when the wind changes direction. None of the riders smiled. Ben pointed toward the brass button hanging around the boy's neck. You know what folks are saying about that thing? Elias stayed quiet. Ben leaned lower in the saddle. They say that button belonged to Captain Holden Mercer. The name landed like distant thunder. Even the horses shifted uneasily. Elias recognized it immediately. Everybody west of Cheyenne knew the story. Captain Holden Mercer had vanished more than 20 years earlier after signing a temporary peace agreement with an Apache tribe near Black Hollow Canyon. 2 weeks later, the agreement disappeared, the captain disappeared, and fighting spread across the territory all over again. Folks said the desert swallowed the truth with him. Ben's eyes narrowed toward the boy. Sheriff Doyle's father. The child slowly closed his hand around the brass button again. Tight this time. Protective. Like holding onto the last piece of a story nobody alive wanted remembered. Then from somewhere far beyond the western ridges came the faint sound of horse bells again. Closer now than before. The sun dropped low behind the Wyoming ridges, turning the whole valley copper red by the time Elias Boone rode into Dry Creek for supplies. People stopped talking when he passed. That was the first thing he noticed. Conversations died halfway through sentences. Chairs creaked softly against saloon floors. Even the piano inside Murphy's Tavern slowed to silence like the player suddenly forgot the tune. Elias tied his horse outside the general store while dust drifted through the street in long thin waves. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and went quiet. The town felt like it was holding its breath. Inside the store, old Martha Reed stood behind the counter stacking canned peaches with trembling hands. She glanced toward Elias, then toward the front window as if checking whether somebody had followed him. "You should not have come into town tonight," she whispered. Elias placed a sack of coffee beans and lamp oil on the counter. "Needed supplies." Martha leaned closer. "Ben Hollister has been stirring folks up since noon. Says that Apache child is carrying proof about Captain Mercer." Elias said nothing. Martha swallowed hard before reaching beneath the counter. "I found this in storage years ago. Thought it belonged to the church." She slid an old photograph across the wood carefully like it might break. The edges were faded white with age. Elias picked it up slowly. 3 men stood in the picture beside a canyon wall somewhere out west. One wore a cavalry coat. Another wore Apache ceremonial beads. And standing between them was a younger Holden Mercer, smiling beside an Apache elder with the same sharp eyes as the boy back at the cabin. Across Mercer's uniform shined the exact same brass button hanging around the child's neck. Elias stared at the photograph without blinking. "Where did you get this?" Martha lowered her voice even more. "After the old church burned down 20 years ago, Reverend Pike told me never to show anybody." Outside, horse hooves suddenly thundered across the dirt street. Loud, fast. Elias stepped toward the window and saw Ben Hollister riding with 6 other men carrying lanterns and rifles across their saddles. None of them looked drunk anymore. They looked determined. Ben spotted Elias through the glass and pulled his horse to a stop. "Town meeting at the saloon," he called out. "Everybody ought to hear what your little Apache friend is hiding." Elias folded the photograph slowly and slipped it inside his coat pocket. The sky outside had darkened into deep blue now, and the first lanterns flickered alive along the street. One by one, townsfolk drifted toward the saloon doors like nervous cattle gathering before a storm. Elias followed more slowly. Inside Murphy's Tavern, the air smelled of whiskey, sweat, and dust baked into old pine boards. Sheriff Doyle Mercer stood near the far wall with both hands resting on his gun belt while Ben Hollister paced in front of the crowd. "That boy carries proof my family got cheated," Ben announced loudly. "My father fought Apache raids for years while Holden Mercer tried making peace with them behind closed doors." Murmurs spread through the room. Doyle's face tightened. Ben pointed toward Elias. "You know why those riders are circling these hills? Because they want whatever that child carries." Elias finally spoke, calm and low. "Maybe they just want their people left alone." Ben laughed once without humor. "You still think this is about kindness?" The saloon doors suddenly creaked open behind them. Cold wind rolled through the room carrying dust and the faint sound of horse bells again. Every man turned toward the entrance at once. But nobody stood there. Only a single leather pouch resting alone in the dirt outside the doorway. Night settled over Dry Creek hard and cold. the kind of western darkness that swallowed whole towns if lanterns went out. Wind moved through the empty street carrying sand against storefront windows while Murphy's Tavern slowly emptied one nervous man at a time. Nobody touched the leather pouch lying outside the saloon door. Nobody even stepped close to it. They all stared at it the same way frontier people stared at rattlesnakes. Sheriff Doyle Mercer finally bent down and picked it up himself. The leather looked old, stitched by hand, darkened from years beneath desert sun. Something heavy rested inside. Doyle untied the cord carefully while half the town watched in silence. Inside the pouch sat a folded paper wrapped around a silver badge dulled with age. Elias recognized the badge immediately. United States Cavalry. Captain rank. Doyle's hand froze before unfolding the paper. The sheriff suddenly looked older standing there beneath the lantern glow. "What does it say?" somebody whispered from inside the saloon. Doyle read silently at first. Then his face drained pale beneath the brim of his hat. Ben Hollister stepped closer impatiently. "Read it." The sheriff swallowed once before speaking out loud. "If this reaches Dry Creek, then know the Apache honored every word of our agreement. The betrayal came from men within our own camp." The saloon turned dead quiet. Even the piano player stopped breathing for a second. Doyle continued slowly, his voice rough now. "Chief Nantan Luda saved 30 soldiers during the winter crossing of Black Hollow Canyon. He deserves peace, not war." The sheriff lowered the paper halfway. Signed, Captain Holden Mercer. No one moved. Outside, wind rattled the wooden signs hanging above the street. Somewhere down near the stable district, a horse stomped nervously against the dirt. Ben Hollister snatched the paper from Doyle's hand. "This proves nothing," he barked. "Could be fake." But his voice had changed. Less certain now. Doyle stared into the darkness beyond town like he had forgotten where he was standing. "My father disappeared 3 days after writing this," he murmured quietly. Elias watched him carefully. Maybe he disappeared because somebody wanted that letter buried. Ben laughed sharply, but nobody joined him. The rancher folded the paper again with quick, angry movements. "You all believe this nonsense, and next thing you know Apache riders will be claiming half the territory." One older man near the poker tables shook his head slowly. "Maybe they already had a claim." Ben's eyes flashed hard toward Elias then. "This whole mess started because you dragged that boy out of the fire." Elias rested one hand against the swinging saloon doors. "No," he answered calmly. "This started 20 years ago." Silence followed him out into the street. The cold night air smelled of sagebrush and distant rain. Elias mounted his horse without hurry and rode north toward his cabin beneath a sky full of hard white stars. Halfway home, he noticed the hills. Tiny lights burned there now, one after another appearing across the ridges west of Dry Creek. Campfires, dozens of them, maybe more. The Apache had arrived. Elias reached the cabin close to midnight. The boy still sat awake beside the lantern inside, holding the brass button tightly between both hands. He looked toward Elias before speaking softly for the first time since arriving there. "They found us." Elias removed his gloves slowly. "Who?" The child stared toward the dark window where distant firelight flickered faintly across the hills. "The men who broke the promise." Then, before Elias could answer, 3 slow knocks echoed against the cabin door. The 3 knocks came again. Slow. Measured. Not the sound of men afraid. Elias Boone rested one hand near the lantern while the Apache boy stood motionless beside the table, his small fingers tightening around the brass button hanging from his neck. Wind pressed softly against the cabin walls outside, carrying the smell of dust and distant campfires drifting down from the western hills. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Elias walked toward the door and opened it halfway. Sheriff Doyle Mercer stood alone on the porch beneath the pale moonlight, his hat low over tired eyes. Frost-colored dust covered his boots from riding hard through the night. "Mind if I come in?" he asked quietly. Elias stepped aside without answering. Doyle entered slowly, removing his gloves near the stove while his eyes settled on the Apache child near the table. The boy watched him carefully but did not back away this time. That seemed to bother the sheriff more than fear would have. "Town is falling apart tonight," Doyle muttered. "Half the men want to run the Apache out before sunrise. The other half are too scared to sleep." Elias poured black coffee into a tin cup and handed it over. "And you?" Doyle stared into the steam rising from the cup. "I spent 20 years believing my father died because of Apache treachery." His jaw tightened. "Now I find out he might have died trying to stop white men from starting a war." The cabin grew quiet again except for the crackling stove and the wind brushing dry grass outside. Then the little Apache boy finally spoke. "My grandfather waited for him." Doyle looked up sharply. The child's voice remained soft but steady now. "At Black Hollow Canyon. Captain Mercer promised soldiers would leave after winter." He lowered his eyes toward the brass button in his hands. "But other men came instead." Elias noticed Doyle's grip tighten around the coffee cup. "What men?" the sheriff asked carefully. The child hesitated. Fear crossed his face for the first time since the fire. Men with silver stars burned into their saddles. Doyle slowly stood from the chair. Elias saw it immediately in the sheriff's eyes. Recognition. Old memory. Something ugly. "Ben Hollister's father carried that mark," Doyle said quietly. Wind suddenly slammed harder against the cabin windows. Then came another sound outside. Hoofbeats. Many of them. Elias stepped onto the porch first. The cold air hit hard beneath a sky washed silver by moonlight. Down below the cabin ridge, across the open prairie, riders moved silently through the dark. Not 10. Not 20. Hundreds. Torchlight rolled across the plains like a river of fire beneath the stars. Apache horsemen stretched from one side of the valley to the other in complete silence. No shouting. No war cries. Just the steady sound of horses breathing beneath the night wind. Doyle stepped beside Elias slowly, his face pale beneath the moon. "Dear God!" The riders stopped nearly 200 yards from the cabin all at once. Perfectly still. Then one figure emerged from the center of the formation riding a white horse marked with black paint along its neck. The old Apache chief sat tall despite his age, wrapped in dark ceremonial blankets that moved softly in the wind. Feathers stirred beside his silver braids. His eyes locked onto the cabin porch from across the field. Elias felt the boy step beside him. "Grandfather," the child whispered. The old chief raised one hand slowly into the air. Behind him, every Apache rider lowered their heads together beneath the moonlight. A valley full of warriors bowing in complete silence. Not for conquest, not for fear, for the child standing beside Elias Boone. The valley stayed silent for so long that Elias Boone could hear the leather reins creaking softly in the hands of the Apache riders below. Moonlight rolled across the prairie in pale silver waves, touching hundreds of horses standing motionless beside their riders. No rifles raised. No threats shouted into the dark. Just patience. The old Apache chief slowly guided his white horse forward until he stopped a few yards from the cabin fence. His face looked carved from desert stone beneath the moonlight, weathered by years that had taken more than they ever returned. The younger warriors behind him remained, perfectly still. Elias stepped down from the porch first. Sheriff Doyle Mercer followed a moment later, though slower, uncertainty heavy in every movement. The Apache boy stood in the doorway watching everything with wide silent eyes. Wind brushed through the dry grass between both sides. The old chief finally spoke in calm, careful English. "The child belongs to my blood." Elias nodded once. "I figured." The chief studied him for a long moment before dismounting from his horse. Even at his age, he moved with quiet dignity that made the entire valley seem to pause around him. When his boots touched the dirt, something unexpected happened. The old Apache leader placed his hand over his chest and lowered his head toward Elias Boone. A gesture of respect. Behind him, every Apache warrior repeated the motion together beneath the cold western sky. Sheriff Doyle stared in disbelief. Elias shifted uncomfortably beneath the weight of hundreds of lowered heads. "You do not bow to me," he said quietly. The chief lifted his eyes again. "Tonight we do." The wind carried sparks from distant campfires across the valley, while the old chief slowly reached beneath his blanket and removed something wrapped in worn buckskin. He handed it carefully to Elias. Inside rested another brass cavalry button tied to a faded strip of blue army cloth, older than the one around the boy's neck. Dirt still clung to the edges like it had spent years buried beneath the earth. "Captain Mercer gave this to me before he died," the chief said. Sheriff Doyle's breath caught sharply beside Elias. The chief turned toward him slowly. "Your father wanted peace." Doyle removed his hat without speaking. The old Apache leader continued. "But men who feared peace killed him before sunrise." Silence spread heavily across the field. Somewhere out in the darkness, horses shifted against the cold wind. Doyle looked down at the brass button in Elias's hand as though seeing his own father for the first time. "Ben Hollister's father," he whispered quietly. The chief nodded once. "And others." The Apache boy suddenly stepped off the porch and crossed the dirt toward his grandfather. The old chief dropped to one knee. Immediately, wrapping both arms around the child beneath the moonlight while every rider behind him lowered their eyes respectfully. Elias watched the boy's face carefully. For the first time since the fire, the fear inside him seemed to loosen. Just a little. The child reached into his shirt and removed the brass button from around his neck. Then he placed it into Sheriff Doyle Mercer's trembling hand. Doyle stared at it silently. "Why give me this?" he asked softly. The boy looked up at him. "Because your father kept his promise." The sheriff's eyes filled with something deeper than grief. Shame maybe, or relief. Before he could answer, hoofbeats suddenly thundered from the south road leading out of Dry Creek. Fast, angry. Lantern light bounced violently across the dark hills below town. Elias turned sharply as nearly 20 armed riders emerged from the darkness with Ben Hollister leading them hard through the valley. Rifles rested across their saddles. Dust followed behind them like smoke. Ben pulled his horse to a stop and glared across the Apache riders gathered before the cabin. "I knew it," he shouted. Savages surrounding the town in the middle of the night. The Apache warriors never moved. Not one reached for a weapon. That silence unsettled the townsmen more than any war cry could have. Ben pointed directly at the child beside the old chief. "That boy carries land claims worth more than this whole valley." Elias slowly stepped between both groups beneath the cold moonlight. "Then maybe land is not worth as much as people think." The cold wind rolling through the valley carried the smell of dust, horse sweat, and rain somewhere far beyond the Wyoming hills. Elias Boone stood alone between two groups of armed men beneath the moonlight while silence stretched tighter than barbed wire across the prairie. On one side stood Ben Hollister and the ranchers of Dry Creek gripping their rifles too hard. On the other stood hundreds of Apache riders sitting perfectly still beneath the pale glow of dawn beginning to creep over the horizon. Nobody moved first. That was the frightening part. Ben Hollister slowly guided his horse forward until dust curled around the animal's hooves. "You think these people came peacefully?" he snapped toward Elias. "They rode in here with an army." Elias never turned around. "An army does not bow before a child." Ben's jaw tightened hard enough to show through his beard. "You have gone blind, old man." Behind Elias, Chief Nanten Luta rested one weathered hand on his grandson's shoulder while watching the valley with calm, unreadable eyes. Sheriff Doyle Mercer stepped forward next, still holding the brass button tightly in his hand. The sheriff looked toward Ben carefully. "There is truth buried here we never wanted to face." Ben laughed bitterly. "Truth?" He pointed toward the Apache riders spread across the hillsides. "Truth is they want land. Same as always." The little Apache boy suddenly spoke from beside his grandfather. No, his voice carried farther across the valley than anyone expected. "You wanted the land." The wind seemed to pause around those words. Ben's expression darkened instantly. "Watch your tongue, boy." But the child did not look away. Fear no longer lived in his eyes now. Only sadness. "My grandfather said Captain Mercer promised both peoples could share the river valley after winter." The child pointed toward the distant northern ridge where moonlight still touched the rocks. "Then men with silver stars came after dark and burned the treaty camp." Murmurs spread among the Dry Creek ranchers. Several lowered their rifles slightly. Doyle Mercer looked toward Ben with growing realization. Your father owned cattle routes through Black Hollow after the treaty disappeared. Ben's silence answered louder than words. Elias saw it happen then. Tiny changes across the faces of the townsmen. Doubt creeping in slowly like dawn light under a door. One older rancher removed his hat and stared toward the ground. Another loosened his grip on his rifle. Ben noticed it too. Panic flashed across his face beneath the anger. Do not listen to them, he barked loudly. This whole valley belongs to us. Chief Nantan Luda finally stepped forward beside Elias Boone. The old Apache leader looked not at Ben, but at the frightened ranchers behind him. For 20 winters, he said calmly. My people stayed away because Captain Mercer died trying to stop bloodshed. His eyes drifted toward Doyle. We honored his sacrifice. The sheriff lowered his head slowly. And we buried it. Dawn light spread wider now across the valley floor, turning the dust pale gold around the horses. Elias reached into his coat and removed the old photograph Martha Reed had given him inside the general store. He handed it silently to Doyle Mercer. The sheriff studied the image beneath the growing morning light. His father standing beside the Apache chief, smiling like brothers instead of enemies. Doyle turned the photograph toward the ranchers behind Ben. This was real, he said quietly. The piece was real. No one answered him. The valley had become too still for lies now. Ben Hollister suddenly jerked his reins sharply and pointed toward the Apache riders. You all think silence changes history? He shouted. These people are still savages. Before anyone else could react, one small movement broke the tension completely. The Apache boy stepped away from his grandfather and walked slowly toward Ben's horse. No fear, no weapon, just a child crossing open dirt beneath a fading moon. He stopped beside the horse and held up the brass cavalry button in his small hand. Your fathers taught us to fear white men, he whispered softly. But this man taught me not all of them are the same. Then he turned and placed the button gently into Elias Boone's weathered palm. Dawn arrived slowly over Dry Creek, soft and pale across the Wyoming plains, like the land itself was tired after carrying 20 years of silence. Nobody fired a shot that morning. That was the part people remembered later. Hundreds of armed men stood beneath the same sky with enough anger between them to bury a generation. And still the only thing louder than the wind was the creaking of saddle leather beneath the cold sunrise. Ben Hollister looked around the valley and finally understood something that frightened him more than Apache riders. He was alone. The ranchers behind him no longer held their rifles the same way. Some lowered them completely. Others could not even meet his eyes anymore. Sheriff Doyle Mercer stepped beside Elias Boone with the old photograph still in one hand and the brass button in the other. Morning light touched both objects together like pieces of a story finally finding each other again. My father died protecting peace, Doyle said quietly to the men of Dry Creek. And we turned his memory into hatred because hatred was easier. No one answered him. Dust rolled softly across the prairie between boots and horse hooves while the Apache riders remained silent beneath the growing light. Chief Nantan Luda slowly mounted his white horse again, his grandson seated carefully before him beneath the dark ceremonial blankets. The old chief looked toward Elias one final time. Your people forgot the promise, he said calmly. But you remembered kindness before history. Elias lowered his eyes for a moment, uncomfortable with words that heavy. I just carried a boy out of a fire. The old chief studied him beneath the rising sun. Most men did not move. Then, without another word, he raised one hand gently toward the riders stretched across the valley. Hundreds of Apache warriors turned their horses together in perfect silence. No victory cry, no threats, only the sound of hooves shifting slowly through morning dust. The entire war party began riding west toward the hills where the campfires still smoked beneath the fading stars. Dry Creek watched them disappear little by little into the golden light of dawn. Some townsfolk removed their hats quietly as they passed. Others simply stood frozen beside fences and storefronts, staring at people they had spent years calling savages. The little Apache boy looked back once before vanishing into the western hills. Just once. Enough for Elias to see him smile faintly beneath the morning light. Then he was gone too. By full sunrise, only hoofprints remained across the valley floor. Sheriff Doyle Mercer stayed behind beside Elias for a long while without speaking. Finally, he handed him the brass cavalry button. "My father would have wanted you to keep it," he said softly. Elias turned the old piece of brass over in his rough, weathered hand while the wind moved gently through the grass around the cabin porch. "No," he answered after a moment. "This belongs here now." He walked toward the fence post beside the porch and pressed the button carefully into the cracked wood where sunlight could touch it every morning. Doyle watched